Hey, I'm Matchstick, and this is writing advice based on things I've learned over 3 decades of writing. Now, although creators can and will do whatever they want in the universes we create, maybe you're like me in preferring a lived-in environment to a purely conceptual city that would fall apart if it tried to actually function. Many fictional cities may glitter like a real city on the surface, with skylines and streets and parks, roads and subways, poor parts and rich parts, and slums. But what are the buildings that make up the skyline? Where do the streets go? Why are the parks there? Who are the people taking the roads and subways? Why are the neighborhoods of different economic classes where they are? Believe it or not, those questions are actually pretty easy to answer, and a story is richer if you map those details out. I've done some reading on urban form and have used it a lot in my writing, which is the extent of my pedigree, but in explaining how I personally build a city, maybe you can learn something for developing your own. I will say that this covers mostly modern and, as far as cars are concerned, Western cities. Let's start with why most cities form: water. I'm going to simplify this part. If you look at a watershed system, you will probably see cities at most points where major tributaries join the main river on the way to the sea. These are river ports and are generally second-tier cities like St. Louis or Chongqing. Major cities tend to form either where a watershed system meets the sea, like New York City, or where large lakes or seas are forced through a bottleneck, as in Istanbul or Chicago. Major cities may form in other ways. For example, Madrid and Washington, D.C. were built as specifically placed capital cities, and Shanghai began as another city's port. Colonialism also throws a major wrench into this logic, but bottom line, it's pretty safe to build a small city at the intersection of two rivers and a big city where a river meets the sea. Cities begin small, all of them. These areas are on the waterfront, generally in an area protected from storms. As cities evolve, they spread out and up. In other words, as suburbs grow, the area that was initially settled becomes a business district with slightly bigger buildings. In turn, as former suburbs form business districts, the initial settlement becomes a downtown with even bigger buildings, and other suburbs pop up on the outskirts. As cities grow, they begin to swallow other settlements, which is how you get unique areas like Greenwich Village in New York or Soma in San Francisco. You can tell they were different cities because the street patterns change between the bigger city and the neighborhood. As cities join, transport links them, and urban development occurs around the train stops and freeway exits. Eventually, the parts in between stops will fully join together and spread out as the new developments form neighborhoods and business districts and their own downtowns. But like I said, cities spread out and up. By the time the outer suburbs are swallowing other cities, the original downtown will be huge, and areas near it will be growing too. There are lots of other factors that can be thrown into the mix here. Fires can gut cities, racism can hollow out neighborhoods, etc. But again, urban growth generally happens like this worldwide. Let's get into economic class neighborhoods. One way an area's wealth can be mapped is related to access. The further away a neighborhood is from transit, the less desirable it is. So hear that again. Access to transit, not vibrant downtowns or parks, determines economic status. If a suburb is well landscaped, but it takes 3 hours to get to work on windy roads, it's not going to be a nice place to live, as people that can afford to will live elsewhere. And even in a poor urban region, the nicest neighborhood is generally next to the exit or train stop. Now, rich neighborhoods are a little trickier because they're not necessarily in places that make sense as a city spreads. These are generally areas that were, at some point during the city's growth, removed enough from the city to be quiet and secure, but close enough to transit to be desirable in that sense. The lots are probably larger here than in other parts of the city, as the presence of bigger houses is usually a sign of a rich area. However, as the city grows, it swallows these areas as well, and they become islands of wealth within the rest of the urban landscape. Let's talk about irregular parcels next. This is one way to refer to a piece of land that is harder to build on than flat land, whether that be a hill or a plot of land with a brook running through it. Irregular parcels tend to be turned into parks, or sometimes government buildings like schools. Hills can also be terraced and built on, and if the view is good, these can be wealthy areas. And if an irregular parcel isn't built on, it may be settled by squatters and turned into an organically constructed cities known as shantytowns, or favelas in Brazil. The big park, for example Renmin Square in Shanghai or Central Park in New York City, is another important feature of many cities, and this is where the influence of politicians is important to take into account. Especially as a city grows, administrations will strive to leave their mark on a city. This is how we get a lot of public works projects like bridges and parks, although the projects may take longer to complete than any one political term. These are sometimes named after the politicians involved. To briefly touch on major transit locations like airports, big intercity train stations tend to be in the middle of cities, especially older ones, while airports will be in places that were, at one time, just outside of the city and next to major roads. You can think of an urban road system like a tree. The trunks are freeways and are built for the most common commutes in the city. The smaller the highway is, the less driven the route. Again, that's simplifying things, but it works. Within suburbs or cities that have been swallowed, feeder roads off of highway exits turn into smaller roads, into streets, into driveways. Streets are often named after where they go, or used to. Church Street goes to the old church. As far as alleys, they're usually found in urban business districts and are generally built for businesses to take care of shipping and trash, although some car-centric suburbs have them in residential areas. Public transit systems are similar to roads, with subways and trains or ferries covering major routes and buses going to less frequented locations. Hired transit, i.e. taxis, tend to stick to certain areas or routes. Helicopters generally run between an airport and a handful of destinations like government buildings, hospitals, or the roofs of important skyscrapers. And speaking of skyscrapers, yes, cities naturally grow up, but a big skyline is also indicative of successful regional criminal organizations who chronically launder money through skyscraper construction. Even if your story doesn't concern organized crime, keep that in mind. There are additional city forms, political capitals, and gambling towns come to mind, but I think I'll leave it here as I've covered a lot. Hopefully this helps some writers out because incorporating some of this stuff into a setting generally enriches the story you're writing. This is Matchstick. Peace out.